Ethan Miller had learned how to live inside silence. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind people warned you about, but a quiet settling, like dust on furniture no one touched anymore. He and Ryan Collins had shared this apartment for nearly 4 years, long enough for routines to replace questions and assumptions to stand in for conversations. From the outside, their life looked finished in the best way, stable, predictable, safe. Inside, Ethan felt unfinished. Every morning followed the same pattern. Ryan woke first, showered, kissed Ethan's forehead with practiced affection, and left for work while checking emails on his phone. Ethan lingered in bed a few minutes longer, staring at the ceiling, wondering when that small kiss had stopped feeling like reassurance and started feeling like punctuation at the end of a sentence already written. Ryan wasn't cruel. That was the hardest part. He was dependable, responsible, and kind in ways that mattered on paper. He paid bills on time, remembered birthdays, and spoke about the future with confidence. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing Ethan. Their conversations skimmed the surface, work stress, groceries, weekend plans, never dipping into the deeper waters where emotions lived. When Ethan tried to talk about feeling distant, Ryan would smile gently and say, "We're fine. Every couple goes through this." Ethan wanted to believe him. He told himself that longing was childish, that comfort was a privilege, not a problem. Still, loneliness crept in during the quiet moments, when he ate dinner alone waiting for Ryan to come home late, or when he lay beside him at night, feeling the warmth of another body without the closeness it promised. Loving someone, Ethan realized, didn't always mean being connected to them. The day Lucas Reed moved in, Ethan wasn't looking for anything to change. They met in the hallway, a collision of grocery bags and awkward apologies. Lucas was taller than Ethan, with tired eyes and an easy smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. He laughed when an orange rolled across the floor and helped gather the rest without making the moment feel embarrassing. "New neighbor," Lucas said, extending a hand. "Lucas." "Ethan," he replied, surprised by how natural it felt to say his name to someone new. That should have been the end of it. A polite exchange, a forgettable introduction. Instead, Lucas paused, asked which apartment was his, and mentioned how confusing the building layout was. It was such a small thing, conversation without an agenda, that Ethan felt oddly lighter afterward. Over the next few days, they crossed paths again. In the elevator, by the mailboxes. Each time, Lucas remembered something Ethan had said before. Asked questions. Listen without rushing to respond. There was no flirtation, nothing inappropriate, just an attentiveness that made Ethan feel present in his own skin. One evening, Ethan mentioned Lucas casually to Ryan while they ate dinner. Ryan nodded, barely looking up from his phone. "That's nice," he said, already distracted. The comment dissolved into the background noise of the television. Ethan noticed the contrast more than he wanted to. He began to recognize how starved he had been for simple acknowledgement. Lucas didn't know him well, yet he seemed curious in a way Ryan no longer was. The realization unsettled Ethan. Gratitude turned into guilt almost immediately. He loved Ryan. He had built a life with him. Feeling this way, noticed, energized, felt like a quiet betrayal, even if nothing had happened. Still, Ethan found himself anticipating those hallway encounters. He told himself it was harmless. Everyone enjoyed friendly neighbors. There was no rule against conversation, no crime in kindness. But at night, lying beside Ryan, Ethan replayed Lucas's smile in his mind and wondered why it had stayed with him longer than it should have. What frightened him most wasn't attraction. It was the relief. For the first time in months, someone had made him feel awake without demanding anything in return. That awareness cracked something open inside him, a thin line running through the carefully constructed life he shared with Ryan. Ethan turned onto his side, staring into the dark, aware of a truth he wasn't ready to face yet. Nothing had changed. And somehow, everything already had. Ethan told himself the conversations with Lucas were incidental, the natural byproduct of living in close proximity. Neighbors talked, that was normal. Yet he began noticing how easily those brief exchanges stretched into minutes, how silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Lucas never rushed to fill it. He seemed content to let moments breathe, and Ethan found himself doing the same. They started running into each other less by accident and more by pattern. Mornings near the building entrance. Evenings near the stairwell. Once, Lucas offered him a cup of coffee from a small cafe down the block, explaining he'd ordered the wrong size. Ethan accepted, knowing it was a flimsy excuse, yet grateful for it anyway. They sat on the low concrete wall outside the building, steam curling into the cool air, talking about nothing important and everything that felt strangely relevant. Lucas spoke openly, without the defensive humor Ethan had grown used to in adult conversations. He mentioned a past relationship that had ended quietly, not in anger but exhaustion. "Sometimes things don't break," Lucas said. "They just stop moving." The words stayed with Ethan longer than he wanted them to. At home, Ethan began noticing the gaps more sharply. Ryan was still kind, still reliable, but distant in a way that felt permanent now. When Ethan talked, Ryan listened with half attention, responding just enough to keep the conversation going. Ethan stopped sharing smaller details first, then bigger ones. It wasn't intentional at the start, it was instinctive, like protecting something fragile. Lucas became the person Ethan spoke to about his day without realizing he had chosen him. He laughed more easily around him, confessed frustrations he had long swallowed, admitted to feeling restless without understanding why. Lucas never offered solutions. He simply acknowledged the feelings, treating them as valid rather than inconvenient. That acknowledgement became addictive. Ethan caught himself editing stories before telling Ryan, removing Lucas from them entirely. The omission felt minor, almost responsible, yet it created a quiet space between truth and presentation. He justified it as privacy. After all, nothing improper was happening. Still, the act of withholding felt heavier each time. One evening, Ryan noticed Ethan's distraction. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said, not accusing, just observant. Ethan shrugged it off, blaming work stress. Ryan accepted the explanation too quickly, as if relieved not to dig deeper. The ease with which the moment passed left Ethan unsettled. With Lucas, moments didn't pass so easily. Their conversations deepened, moving from casual anecdotes to reflections neither of them rushed to explain away. Lucas asked questions that required thought, not performance. He remembered Ethan's answers. When Ethan spoke about feeling unseen, Lucas didn't contradict him or minimize it. He simply said, "That sounds lonely," and meant it. The word landed harder than comfort ever had. Ethan knew he was crossing a line, though he couldn't name exactly where it was. There had been no touch, no confession, no promise. Yet his emotional energy had shifted. He waited for messages he hadn't admitted he wanted. He looked forward to seeing Lucas in a way that made his chest tighten with anticipation and guilt in equal measure. Late one night, Ethan lay awake beside Ryan, listening to his steady breathing. He wondered when love had stopped feeling like choice and started feeling like obligation. The thought scared him enough to turn toward Ryan, seeking reassurance in familiarity. Ryan stirred but didn't wake. The distance between them felt measured now, exact. The next afternoon, Ethan ran into Lucas again. They stood in the hallway longer than necessary, neither quite ready to leave. Lucas hesitated, then said softly, "You don't have to answer this, but, are you happy?" Ethan laughed reflexively, a practiced deflection, then stopped. The question lingered, patient and unyielding. He realized no one had asked him that directly in a long time. "I don't know," Ethan admitted finally. Lucas nodded, as if that answer was enough for now. As Ethan walked back into his apartment, the weight of what he'd said settled over him. He hadn't confessed anything concrete, yet the honesty felt irreversible. For the first time, Ethan understood that emotional boundaries didn't shatter all at once. Sometimes, they dissolved quietly, through listening, through understanding, through being known. And he wasn't sure how to stop it anymore. Ethan began to notice how intentional his days had become. He adjusted his schedule without admitting why, leaving the apartment a few minutes earlier, returning a little later, lingering in shared spaces where coincidence felt increasingly deliberate. He told himself these changes were harmless, yet each choice carried weight, as if he were quietly voting for a life he hadn't yet claimed. Lucas noticed too. "You keep running into me," Lucas said one evening, a faint smile softening the observation. There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity. Ethan laughed, but the sound came out thin. He wondered when honesty had started feeling more dangerous than silence. Their conversations shifted, not in content but in gravity. Words landed heavier now, pauses longer. Lucas spoke about the fear of repeating old patterns, of staying in situations that dulled rather than nurtured. Ethan listened with an intensity that felt intimate, absorbing meaning between sentences. He recognized himself in Lucas's reflections more than he expected. At home, Ryan sensed the change, even if he couldn't name it. He tried harder, suggested dinners, planned a weekend away, reached for Ethan's hand more often. The effort stirred guilt rather than comfort. Ethan wanted to respond fully, to step back into the relationship with renewed presence, but something in him resisted. The emotional energy he once reserved for Ryan had already been spent elsewhere. That realization frightened him. Ethan began compartmentalizing, telling himself he was managing the situation responsibly. He hadn't crossed any obvious boundary. There had been no declarations, no physical closeness. Still, he found himself waiting for Lucas's messages, replaying their conversations, measuring his own reactions with unsettling precision. Emotional honesty had become a currency he was spending unevenly. One evening, Lucas stopped him in the stairwell. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "And if you don't want to answer, I'll understand." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Okay, are you staying where you are because you want to?" Lucas asked, "or because leaving feels worse?" The question stripped away Ethan's rehearsed explanations. He searched for a careful response and found none that felt true. "I don't know how to leave without destroying everything," he said instead. Lucas exhaled slowly. "I don't want to be the reason you break something," he said. "But I don't want to pretend this is nothing either." The honesty between them hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. There was no touch, yet the closeness felt more intimate than any physical gesture Ethan could remember recently. He realized then that the line he'd been avoiding naming had already been crossed, not through action, but through mutual recognition. That night, Ethan sat across from Ryan at the kitchen table. Ryan talked about work, about plans, about a future he still believed in. Ethan listened, nodding, responding appropriately, feeling like an observer in his own life. When Ryan reached for his hand, Ethan didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. The space between them felt newly defined. Later, alone in the bathroom, Ethan stared at his reflection. He looked the same, yet something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer confused about what he wanted, he was afraid of what wanting it would cost. The next day, Ethan told Lucas he needed distance. The words tasted false even as he said them. Lucas accepted the request without protest, which hurt more than resistance would have. The absence that followed was immediate and sharp, confirming what Ethan had tried to deny. By evening, Ethan understood the truth he'd been circling for weeks. He was living two emotional lives, and neither could continue untouched. Avoiding a decision had become its own form of betrayal, one that implicated everyone involved. As he lay awake beside Ryan, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing, Ethan realized there was no version of this story where nothing changed. The question was no longer if the truth would surface. It was how much damage would come with it. The confrontation came quietly, which somehow made it worse. Ryan didn't raise his voice or demand explanations. He waited until the apartment was still, until the television was off and the day had nowhere left to hide. Then he sat across from Ethan, hands folded, eyes steady. "You're not here anymore," Ryan said. "I need to know why." Ethan had rehearsed this moment in fragments, never as a whole. Now the words felt fragile, but necessary. He spoke slowly, choosing honesty over comfort. He told Ryan about the loneliness, about feeling unseen, about how he had let someone else listen when he should have insisted on being heard at home. He didn't dramatize it, he didn't excuse it, he named it for what it was. An emotional affair. Ryan absorbed the truth without interruption. When Ethan finished, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy with understanding. Ryan nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "I wish you'd told me sooner," Ryan said. There was sadness in his voice, not anger. "I would have tried. Maybe we both would have." The absence of blame hurt more than accusation ever could have. Ethan apologized, knowing apologies couldn't restore what had already eroded. They spoke late into the night, untangling years of shared habits and unspoken disappointments. By the time the conversation ended, the outcome felt inevitable. They agreed to end the relationship with the same quiet respect it had been built on. The days that followed were marked by logistics and restraint. Dividing belongings, scheduling time apart, saying goodbye to routines that had once felt permanent. Ethan felt grief and relief in equal measure, an emotional dissonance that left him exhausted. Freedom, he learned, didn't arrive cleanly. It came tangled with loss. Lucas noticed the change before Ethan said anything. When Ethan finally told him the truth, Lucas listened carefully, the way he always had. He didn't celebrate or claim a victory. Instead, he stepped back. "I don't want to be a replacement," Lucas said. "I want to be a choice." The words landed with clarity. Ethan respected them, even as disappointment settled in. He realized then that wanting something didn't entitle him to it, especially when consequences were still unfolding. Time passed, not dramatically, but deliberately. Ethan learned how to be alone again, how to sit with his thoughts without distraction, how to acknowledge mistakes without turning them into identity. He missed Ryan in unexpected moments, not because he wanted the relationship back, but because shared history leaves impressions that don't vanish easily. One evening, weeks later, Ethan ran into Lucas by chance. The encounter felt different now, less charged, more grounded. They talked, carefully at first, then with growing ease. There was no urgency, no hidden agenda. Just honesty, earned the hard way. "I needed to figure out who I was without leaning on anyone," Ethan said. Lucas smiled, not with relief, but recognition. "Me too." They didn't define anything that night. They didn't need to. What existed between them was no longer built on secrecy or escape. It stood on accountability, which felt sturdier than longing ever had. As Ethan walked home alone, he reflected on how quietly his life had changed. Infidelity, he understood now, wasn't always about desire overpowering loyalty. Sometimes it was about avoiding truths until they demanded attention. Sometimes it was about mistaking comfort for commitment and connection for obligation. He unlocked the door to his apartment, stepping into a space that was finally his alone. The silence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like possibility, earned, fragile, and honest. Ethan didn't know what would come next. He only knew that whatever followed would be chosen, not defaulted into. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.